kind of dark.
Okay, and others.
What? It's okay, don't worry about it. It's on the lecture is more important.
It's the
Welcome everybody. Okay, we all have
Hold it.
we have the again. Okay. The gentleman sitting to my right, I'm standing. The gentleman sitting to my right, Jacob Gluck. We have the good fortune of having him maybe one or two last time. Just shortly, he's on the road to China. He's going to explore the Great Wall. And that which divides us. But until he does that, he's going to give us a month or so. And we've all heard lectures from him. We've all heard lectures from him before, so we don't know what to expect. He's going to speak on Jewish denominational diversity in the United States. So there we go.
Okay. It's a very cavernous room here, so I hope everyone hears me.
Come sit closer so we
that's a good idea.
So you can hear us. And if you want to talk out in the back room. Outside.
Thank you, Leo. That's very good.
No talking in the air, talking outside. Can I say that? Come on, let's get closer.
Yeah.
Because, you're not going to hear us.
Okay, what I want to do in this lecture, I want to talk about the three major Jewish denominations in America. We have Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. There are other streams of Judaism. There is Reconstructionist, there's Karlabas, there's of course Haredi, which is the community I grew up in. But I won't cover those movements as much, because those, the three that I mentioned earlier, those are the largest ones by far. And to a large extent, the smaller ones have been inspired by the larger ones. And it's really a subset of the larger denominations. So let's talk about Reform first, because Reform is the oldest one in America, and it's the most organized one. It used to have the most adherents, the most congregations, and also because they are the most revolutionary. Okay, it raises eyebrows. How are they different, and why are they different? The earliest Reform congregation in America. Does anyone have any guess where it was?
Yes.
Who said yes? What?
1647.
Did you say Rhode Island?
South Carolina.
South Carolina is correct. You said Rhode Island?
Never mind.
I didn't hear you. Okay. South Carolina is correct. It's called the Reformed Society of Israelites. And it's 1825. By the way, what else happened in 1825? In New York, the Erie Canal, and the abolition of slavery. So 1825 is a famous year. But that's the year that the Reformed Society of Israelites formed in Charles Carolina. So they basically seceded from their congregation because they were unhappy with certain rituals that they wanted to reform. And so at the time, New York City wasn't a Jewish center at the time. Most immigrants were either Sephardi or they were German, and they were peddlers, so they spread throughout the country. They weren't necessarily concentrated in large cities or New York City. So this is why you have such a place in South Carolina as the headquarters of Reform. And so later it became much better organized from a single society, which is not necessarily a congregation, it's simply like a movement, it's a club, with an idea. So from that it became organized both as congregations. Congregations started to join this huge wave of reform, and then eventually it became parent organizations that organized the reform movements into umbrella organizations. For example, we have the UAHC, which you can see here, the first entry on the upper left corner, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. This is the oldest one. This is from, I mean, it happened much later. I'm fast forwarding several decades here. 1873 is when all those reform congregations unionized under a single entity. And so that's the first one. And then 2 years later, you have Hebrew Union College. Hebrew Union College, the very famous top Hebrew Union College. They have 4 campuses nowadays. One in New York City, one in Cincinnati, that was the original one. And then in Los Angeles they have one. And then of course Jerusalem, the one they opened in 1969, I believe. Yeah, something like that. And by the way, nowadays it's required, rabbinical students are required to attend 1 year at the campus in Jerusalem. And maybe I'll get back to that later, because this is indicative of the acceptance of Zionism by the Reform movement, which wasn't the case in its early years. For many, many decades, they were very much opposed to Zionism, because they saw Zionism as a nationhood, seeing the Jewish people as a nation, as a peoplehood. And they resisted that because they believed that the Jews are just simply a religion. It's not a distinct ethnic group, right? So we're Americans. For all intents and purposes, we're simply Americans. We just happen to be of the Mosaic persuasion. That's what they called it back then, like 150 years ago. The word Jew, by the way, back then, it was a pejorative. It had this negative connotation. So people didn't call themselves Jews. Very often you would hear Hebrews or people of the Mosaic tradition. So this is, by the way, this is what explains why the union was also called Union of American Hebrew Congregations. Nobody nowadays would ever create such a name, movement, an organization in such a way. Okay, so 2 years later, in 1876, you have the Hebrew Union College. So what's the purpose of the Hebrew Union College? The purpose is to train rabbis for America. So this is a revolutionary idea because up until then, the rabbis who served in American congregations, whether be it Orthodox or Reform congregations, were not native born. They were from the old country. Okay, very often Germany, sometimes from other places such as Hungary or even Eastern Europe. There was, for example, one Polish rabbi who served, who was very active in the early Reform movement. So the Hawk is very revolutionary in that sense because it tries to instill in the American rabbinate a sense of the ideals of Reform, and so that it can train. And so with the rabbi who was inspired by Reform, the congregations can also be swept along with this new movement. And lastly, the last organization we have is the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is similar to Wisachtas or Rabbanim, if anyone knows, like which is serves the Haredi community. I mean, that's the one that I know, so that's why I'm mentioning it. But of course, there are many more rabbinical organizations, right? The OU, exactly. So if you look at the last, the top upper right column and row, then you see the OU. The OU, the full name of the OU is UOJCA, the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations. So the OU was actually at its outset. It wasn't designed as a union of rabbis, rather it was a union of congregations. Okay, the union of rabbis for the Orthodox sector was something else. It was known as the RCA, the Rabbinical Conference of America. And nowadays the RCA is affiliated with, does anyone know? Soloveitchik. Okay, so this is considered modern Orthodox nowadays. And there's another early Orthodox organization called the UOR, Union of Orthodox Rabbis. You're not alone. You heard of that, huh? Okay. Pop quiz. Who knows the Hebrew equivalent, the UOR? Anybody? Agudas HaRabbanim. Has anyone heard of it?
Yeah.
Who said yeah? Okay, so can you explain it? What is Agudas HaRabbanim?
Explain it. I heard of it.
Okay. So the Agudas HaRabbanim was formed in the very early 20th century. And so what was its purpose? The rabbis in the Agudas HaRabbanim, unlike any other rabbinical organization, they spoke Yiddish. And they were averse to all this modernization, any change at all, even if it's not Reform, it doesn't matter. You know, everything has to be traditional, the way you did it in the old country. And so that was the Agudas HaRabbanim. And they were also known to issue all these writs of excommunication. They excommunicated Kaplan when Kaplan proposed that things are not necessarily divinely revealed, things evolve organically, and halacha is not necessarily passed on, transmitted faithfully through the generations. Rather, it's people. There's a human input in that, and so as they excommunicated him for that, there was another person they excommunicated, which I don't remember offhand. But so they were very active in this old world style of control.
You're talking about the Agudas Sarabana?
Yes.
Where are they on this?
They are not here on the slide.
Where do they belong?
They belong in RCA, the bottom right row, the bottom right box. They're the equivalent of the RCA. The difference in the RCA and the UOR, the Agudas Sarabana, is that the RCA eventually became more modern Orthodox, whereas the Agudas Sarabana considered itself more traditional. All right, so it didn't adapt to the American soil, the American environment. Essentially, the Agudas Sarabana had rabbis, first-generation rabbis that were trained in Europe, and they still spoke Yiddish. Eastern Europeans, not German rabbis, of course. Okay, so that was the UOR. It's not listed on the slide, but it would be the equivalent of the RCA. Okay, so another very important organization that I should mention is the JPS. I'm sure many of you have heard of the JPS, Jewish Theological Seminary. It's the first organ of what later became conservative Judaism. At the time, conservative Judaism as such didn't yet exist. Those who didn't accept the reforms of the Reformed community, they considered themselves traditional, and sometimes they called themselves Orthodox. But it wasn't organized as a coherent group. And so the JPS, the purpose of the JPS was as an alternative to the Hebrew Union College, because the Hebrew Union College rabbis, by and large, espoused reform. And also the methods of study and the conclusions that they came to and the whole methodology wasn't something that would be acceptable to the people who decided to to educate rabbis in the JPS. So the JPS became more conservative. And at the time of its founding, it wasn't exactly clear exactly where in the spectrum they would stand, whether they're going to be strictly Orthodox or they would accept some changes. Now, later in time, they assumed this position of what we now know as conservative Judaism, which is that change is acceptable if it's really necessary. But we're not going to reevaluate all our traditions and recast everything in a revolutionary manner, which is essentially which epitomizes what conservative Judaism stands for nowadays. Okay, so that takes care of this table here. Obviously, the Riyadh is Rabbi Isaac O'Connell out of the seminary, and that's affiliated with the YU, and that trains Orthodox rabbis. Okay, let me talk briefly about the OU. Now, the OU originally it was a union of Orthodox congregations, and later it became, people refer to it in short as OU. After the war, originally it's a union of congregations. It's not a rabbinical association. It's not supposed to do anything beyond simply unite congregations. By that I mean the president of the congregation would attend a conference once a year or something like that to discuss things of importance to the Jewish community. But eventually it transitioned to become a certifying agency. So nowadays the only field that it still occupies itself in is the field of certifying Jewish producers of food manufacturers. And so that's basically, mostly, as far as I'm concerned, the only thing that they do nowadays. And for other purposes, you have other organizations. Okay.
What was it in Europe before they came up? Why didn't they transplant here?
The reform?
Yeah. Was there any
I'm getting that right now. See, with this slides? Okay, so we're going to cover now what are the reform practices? What does reform stand for? Okay. Reform, first of all, let me talk about the ideology of reform. The ideology of reform is, reform was a response to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment swept the entire Western Europe in the early 19th century, late 18th century, early 19th century. And the German Jews were very much inspired by that and accepted that wholeheartedly. Almost completely. Even those who remained Orthodox accepted the ideas of the Enlightenment. And so the German Jews when they came, there was a huge Jewish immigration wave to America starting in 1848. And so when those immigrants came to America, they carried with them the traditions of reform and enlightenment. So what do those ideas represent? They represent first and foremost an acceptance of science. Okay, the idea that you need to study and research professions. Okay, Jews are no longer going to be restricted to their ghettos. They're going to venture out and go to college, get educated, and pursue the same sort of careers that Christians pursue. Because up until then, those careers were closed to Jews, and Jews were not admitted to the university either. But starting with the Enlightenment, those restrictions were curtailed. And so those are some of the general ideas. And the problem with ritual is that the Reformed Jews didn't see ritual as compatible with their Enlightenment ideas. It seemed so outlandish to them. So they could have preserved it, but it wouldn't have been, it didn't feel proper for them. So some of the things that they, for example, that they did is that they propounded this idea that we are no longer a Jewish nation. We belong to the nationality of our host country. So if we're German Jews, we're Germans first and Jews second. Jews is simply a practice that we do in the privacy, in the confines of our own organization. So when we step into the synagogue, we're Jews. But when we step out of the synagogue, we're simply Germans. They would not be distinguishable by dress, by language, by culture, by demeanor, or anything like that. So as a corollary to that, they were not comfortable with all the prayers that the Orthodox people say in the Shemona Esrei and in other parts of the liturgy, where we pray to God to restore Zion, to restore sacrificial worship. Zion, obviously, the kingdom of David. This is a political aspiration. Okay? It's a political aspiration which is treasonous to think about it, right? Because if you're a German Jew, if you're an American Jew, if you're loyal to your host country, why are you praying to restore the Davidic kingdom? So they were very not comfortable with that, and so they eliminated, they excised those parts of the prayer from the Siddur. Another thing that they did is the mixed choir. By mixed, I mean mixed between Jews and Gentiles. Yes, the Reformed Jews from Germany and later in America, they accepted Protestant compositions in the synagogue, or in the temple, as I prefer to call it. So you would have, up there in the chamber where the organ was played, you would have a Protestant composer and player who would be involved in the composition and the playing of the hymns that would be performed during the liturgy. And of course they have family pews, which means that the women can sit together with the men, which is relatively a moderate reform, as we'll see later. It was also accepted by the conservatives. Another very interesting thing to note is no second-day holidays. Yom Tov Sheni Shogolios, the second exilic holiday, they eliminated that. Why? Because it's not required. Even according to halacha, the reason why people did it is because they didn't know, back before Hillel standardized the calendar, Jews and the diaspora didn't know when Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, would be, and so therefore they observed the second day. So that was no longer deemed necessary, so that was eliminated. The organ, which I mentioned, the organ is not halachic. Why is the organ not halachic? Who knows? Does anyone want to chime in?
Because they had it in the temple.
Can you speak up, please?
Because in the temple in Yerushalayim, there used to be instruments, and we're supposed to rebuild it before we have all the instruments.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. In the Talmud, it does. There are some opinions in the Talmud that you're not allowed to play any musical instruments because. Oh, now you're mentioning on Shabbat, so that's a separate thing. So there are two components here. One is there are certain halachic opinions in the Gemara that you're not allowed to play any musical instrument until the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash, of the temple, because we're mourning the temple. So how could we play any instrument since we're so grief-stricken by the destruction of the temple? So that's one opinion in the Talmud. But there's another thing which is much more stricter and much more universally accepted in Judaism, which is that you're not allowed to play a musical instrument on the Sabbath. Shema, how does the Hebrew go? Shema, you have it clear, right? Lest he will fix an instrument, which would be a violation of the Sabbath. So that's why, as a against that, you're not allowed to play any instrument, even if the instrument is in working condition. So the organ is against the Jewish law, but the early reformists really liked that. Why? Because first of all, in many ways they simply imitated the Protestants. The Protestants had. But beyond that, it's not just simply imitating the Protestants on a particular practice. It's more like the general idea behind it, which is, first of all, the decorum, okay, the dignified atmosphere, okay, the inspiration that you draw from music. Okay, so all of that is something that they espoused. And like the traditional synagogue services, you would have a lot of participation by the audience. Like the audience would chant along and everything. And in the Reform temples, you didn't have that. You had the cantor had a much more prominent role, and there was no communal singing. Okay, and the choir was very prominent. The choir took a very central role in the services. So the choir, the cantor, and you were simply supposed to sit down, relax, and observe the show in certain ways. Because this is how it was in the Protestant churches. Okay, the abbreviated liturgy, as I mentioned, they expurgated certain parts that they didn't feel comfortable with, but in addition to that, the traditional Judaism placed a lot of emphasis on recitation. Just say, keep saying, you know, Zugos Gans Tehillim, you know, recite the whole Psalms in 2 hours. So the Reformers said, okay, better think, okay, better be inspired than simply mindless recitation of words without being influenced and transformed by it. So they simply eliminated certain parts of the prayer because it's tedious. You know, 3 times praying per day, and each prayer, okay, you can't really be mechavan, be thinking about the prayers if you're gonna the way the shacharit is practiced nowadays, people just they mumble. It's not, people don't think, right, they do very fast. They don't think what they're saying. So their innovation was, instead of saying the entire siddur, say 20% of it, and think about what you're saying. And if it has no meaning to you, don't say it. And which is why they got rid of the parts of the prayer that they didn't like. For example, we mentioned the nationalized parts, right? The parts that strive for the restoration of Zion, sacrificial worship. You know, they didn't believe that sacrificial worship would be restored. Things like that. Okay, the sermon in the vernacular, another important thing, and this was also embraced by other denominations. Okay, so you would have a sermon in Germany, it was in German, in America it was in English. Okay, now of course in the Orthodox congregations it would only be in Yiddish, or there was no sermon at all. So actually the centrality of the sermon is also the very fact that the sermon is such an important part of the services was also a new idea. And in fact, in some congregations, some members showed up only for the sermon. They showed up late and they left early. And the sermon was kind of like the central thing of the whole world. The food, yeah, they didn't have food. The firms would never accept eating in it. For the Reform, the temple was a very sacred place. This is another difference, by the way. It's not mentioned in this table here. But for the Reform, it was a very dignified place. You wouldn't, there's no talking in a Reform temple like you have in a traditional, I mean, at least in the Haredi synagogues. A lot of chatter all the time. You don't have that. It's extremely dignified. And, you know, there's not a word uttered. You know, you have the patience, you sit through it. It's no longer than half an hour, It's not that long. But while you're there, enjoy. Okay? Pay attention. And, okay, no head coverage. They got rid of the yarmulke. Okay, Taisa, it's not the biggest sin. It's not even halachic per se. And another thing is late Friday evening services. What does that mean? Well, does anyone know what that means? Does anyone want to interject? What does it mean late Friday evening services? What do I mean by that?
Late Friday.
As opposed to?
Sunset.
What's the idea? What do I mean? Why is it a reform? The reason it's a reform is because back then people worked on Friday. Friday was a regular work day. Saturday was too, by the way. But Friday was certainly a regular work day. So they didn't get off until the evening. They didn't get off until 8 o'clock in the summer, at least, right? So, in the winter too. They didn't get off until 8 o'clock. So when are you going to hold the Friday night prayer? So in traditional congregations, it would be held when the sun sets, right? So the sunset is often early, and nobody would show up because people were still working. So what the Reform did is said, okay, let's be honest with ourselves. Okay, let's be frank. If we hold services early, nobody's going to show up. So, okay, let them finish their work, and we're going to do late services. So that's another thing that the Reform people did. And by the way, the early Reform congregations, very often, many of them, did not hold Saturday services for the same reason, because people worked on Saturday. And so they would have late Friday evening services, and then they would have Sunday morning services.
But does they have bar mitzvah? Yeah, they did.
Okay, you mentioned bar mitzvah. Bar mitzvah is a completely separate topic. Under classical Reform, by the way, there is no bar mitzvah. They instituted an institution called, excuse me? They instituted a new institution called confirmation, which is a Protestant practice where the catechumen, the person who is accepting the religion, confirms, right, affirms, or confirms that they are part of the community, and they're accepting the doctrines and the ideas behind the religion. And so confirmation usually takes place 2 or 3 years after bar mitzvah, the bar mitzvah equivalent age of 12 or 13. So the early classical reformists of the late 19th, early 20th century, they would not practice bar mitzvah at all. So there would be a confirmation ceremony, okay, the equivalent of the Protestant version, and that's it. And later, of course, in many later years, they readopted traditional practices, and so nowadays it's very common to have even among the Reformed, to have a bar mitzvah. But in the early years they wouldn't have it.
Do they put tefillin on?
Do they put on what?
Tefillin.
Good question. Do they put on tefillin? Under classical Reform, no. Which brings me to the next slide. Okay, this is very important. I want to read out this slide because this is so central to understanding what Reform stands for. Okay, this is known as the Pittsburgh Platform.
Also, I wanted to ask, was like bat mitzvah for girls?
Bat mitzvah for girls is not a Reform idea. Because, like I said, the early Reformists did not practice bar mitzvah. So there was no need to make a bat mitzvah if you're not making the bar mitzvah. The earliest bat mitzvah was practiced by Mordecai Kaplan, the Reconstructionists. So for them, bar mitzvah was an important idea, and they wanted to make it more egalitarian. So they said, okay, let's do the same ceremony for a girl.
Okay.
Mordecai Kaplan is World War I period. So this is already at the closing age of classical Reform. At that point, Reform was undergoing a transition as well. Okay, so under classical Reform, there wouldn't be any bat mitzvah nor bar mitzvah, and later under Mordecai Kaplan and the conservative movement, you would accept a bat mitzvah. And nowadays, it's even accepted by modern Orthodoxy, and the Haredim are still, the ultra-Orthodox are still resistant to it. Okay, so I want to read the Pittsburgh Platform to you. It's so central and so important, and it's so revolutionary in the history of Judaism, and it's so bold, and what a chutzpah that they have to say the things that they're saying. So let me read the Pittsburgh Platform. This is the official Reform Convention in 1885. They finally got together, and they codified what they believed in. Okay, so they said like this: we recognize the Mosaic legislation, a system of training the Jewish people for its mission during its national life in Palestine, and today we accept as binding only its moral laws, and maintain only such ceremonies as elevate and sanctify our lives. Those are the critical words. They only maintain such ceremonies as elevate and sanctify our lives, but reject all such that are not adapted to the views and habits of modern civilization. So to answer your question, why they don't put on phylacteries, because they don't consider it as elevating and sanctifying our lives. What's the phylactery? It's a piece of skin with some parchment and words on it. What does that have to do with anything? Okay, that's the classical Reform approach. So classical Reformists would not put on tefillin, they would not put on a prayer shawl in the synagogue, they would not, the yarmulke was gone, they did not keep kosher dietary laws, which brings me to the next, is it the second one? Yeah, the second one. Okay, we hold that all such Mosaic rabbinical laws as regulate diet, priestly purity, and dress. So by dress they refer to the prayer shawl and shatnez, the separation of linen and wool, things like that, originated in ages and under the influence of ideas entirely foreign to our present mental and spiritual state. They fail to impress the modern Jew with a spirit of priestly holiness. Their observance in our days is apt rather to obstruct rather than to further modern spiritual elevation. So the catchphrase that keeps repeating itself is spiritual elevation. They wouldn't accept practices that don't elevate us spiritually. In other words, they don't have any meaning to a modern Jew. If you can't connect this with any meaning to yourself and the community, and if it doesn't have any obvious reason to do it, then we're not going to practice it.
This was in America?
This was in America, yes. Pittsburgh platform. Pittsburgh was in Pennsylvania. Yeah, 1885. So this laid down the foundations of classical reform. And these foundations officially existed until 1937. In 1937, there was, they issued a new platform known as the Columbus platform. So with the Columbus platform, they reversed certain ideas here. They started becoming more accepting of, for example, of national ideals. At that point, Zionism was already going pretty strong, and they started accepting that. And they also came up with this new concept that this trinity, that they have God, Israel, and Torah, and those are three important legs in Judaism. It's accepted, for example, the study of Torah, right? The concept of Israel, like we are a people. We're not just a religion. We are a distinct people. And so they became more. They reverted. And they returned a little more to the right with the Columbus platform. And later, of course, in 1976 and still later in 1999, they issued additional platforms which came even more back to accepted even more traditions. And nowadays, for example, I don't know, it's not uncommon for a Reform person to put on a talid or a tefillin and all that. The reason they do it is not because they have renounced the Pittsburgh platform. The problem with Reform is that it came so far in its early classical years. Right? It came so far in terms of integration and assimilation that it lost its identity completely. Not just as a national, as an ethnic unit, but even as a religion. So in other words, it meant nothing. To be Reformed Jew, what do you stand for? A Reformed Jew couldn't even answer that. You're not speaking Hebrew. You don't like Israel. You don't like Torah. You don't pronounce tefillin. You don't observe the Sabbath. You don't observe dietary laws. What do you stand for? What does Judaism mean to you? And so they lost the whole thing. Basically, they reached a crisis, and the response to that is to accept more ritual, not because you have to, but because you choose to. So nowadays, the motto of modern Reform is a Jew by choice. And by the way, it's completely acceptable in the Reform circles. It's completely acceptable if your parent is Jewish and you don't like it. They're not going to put pressure on you. If you don't like it, you don't like it. You're not a Jew. In fact, the definition of a Jew, according to Reform, is that, which brings me to another controversy, which is called the patrilineal descent controversy. So the definition of a Jew, according to Reform, is that one of your parents is Jewish, and you have affirmed that Jewish identity. So that is required in order for you to be qualified as a Jew. If you don't want to be Jewish, right, then you're not Jewish. So we're not forcing Judaism upon you. Okay, so Jew by choice is an important slogan of the Reform movement. Okay, I want to show you several pictures of leading figures in the three denominations. I didn't cover conservative and Orthodox yet, but I'm going to cover them in the course of the display of these photos. So first we have Isaac Mayer Wise. I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that half of you have heard of him. Who has heard of him before? Raise your hand. Not half, okay. Shulam, do you mind saying what do you know about him? What?
I'll leave it to you.
You leave it to me? Okay. Anyone else? What do you know about Isaac Mayer Wise? A mustache. Of course, he's affiliated with Reform, of course. Now, he is the person that first comes to mind when you're thinking about classical Reform. The reason why he is so prominent is because, first of all, he founded all three organizations that we saw earlier were founded by him, essentially. The Hebrew Union College, the UAHC, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, and finally the CCAR. That was the last organization founded by the Reform movement. That was 1889. So that's like 15 years after the UAHC.
What does CCAR stand for?
It's Central Conference of American Rabbis. So that's the rabbinical organization of the Reform movement. And so he was instrumental in all of those. He so he lived in Cincinnati, am I right? Yeah, Cincinnati. And so that was him. And by the way, he wasn't the most radical reformist. There were people who were even more radical than him. There was David Einhorn, for example, who, like for him, for example, keeping kosher is okay. Okay, why not? Let's keep kosher. I mean, he wasn't so adamantly against it. It was the radical reformists who ultimately had their way, against keeping kosher and against other practices. And the Pittsburgh platform was essentially adopted those radical reform ideas. And there was, of course, this famous event that there were many rabbis who were invited to this rabbinical conference of the UAHC, and they didn't serve kosher, and this is why certain rabbis departed, and that triggered them to found the JPS, because it was so outraged by the fact that the UAHC did not accommodate, did not serve kosher. Like what is this? How ridiculous is this? A conference of rabbis? Like the lay people, okay, they didn't, everyone knew that they didn't keep kosher. Even the Orthodox congregations back then, many lay people didn't observe kosher. It was difficult, it was extremely difficult. And you traveled all the time, you didn't have access to it. But anyway, so that's Isaac Mayer Weiss. He's the most prominent figure in Reform Judaism, and he founded all three movements. Stephen Weiss, not related to Isaac Mayer Weiss at all, he founded the Free Synagogue movement. There's a Free Synagogue, there are at least, I mean, there are dozens of them nowadays. But what does free mean? Free actually means that the rabbi is free to speak without oversight by the board. That's actually what it means. Because he was actually invited by Temple Emmanuel, which is the flagship reform temple in America. It's located on East 65th Street and Upper East Side. And so Temple Emmanuel was considering hiring him as a rabbi. So the board, the board inquired whether he would consent, whether he would agree. And the board told him that part of the conditions were that the board would have oversight over his sermons. Remember, sermons in the Reformed congregation is a central part of the liturgy. It's very, very central to the services. And so, they wanted to put controls on him and be able to force him to not say certain things if they were not in the spirit of the congregation. And he was outraged. How can you say the role of a rabbi, he said, is to be like the prophets of the Old Testament, you know, to rail against the problems of the day and to the wrongs and evils of the day. And so you can't shut up a rabbi. If you don't want to follow the rabbi, okay. If you don't want to agree with me, I'm not forcing my opinion upon you, but don't shut me up. So in response to this, he founded the Free Synagogue. So free again means the rabbi is free to say whatever he wants. Okay? So, and I highly encourage you guys to visit after he passed away in 1949, they renamed the synagogue as SWFS, Stephen Wise Free Synagogue. So if you go to Manhattan, you can see the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue.
It's not Temple Emmanuel.
Temple Emmanuel never hired him. That's my point. They didn't hire him because of this issue.
Excuse me?
And in fact, he sent a letter to the New York Times about this whole scandal. And the New York Times published his letter, and Emmanuel was very angry, like, why are you airing dirty laundry in public? Why are you telling the whole world about this? You don't want to accept our proposal? Okay, be quiet, shut up.
What year was that, Morris?
This was, I don't know the exact year, it was late 19th or early 20th century. Yeah.
Also, I wanted to ask you, when you said earlier that for Reform Judaism, Judaism means that you're Jewish by choice, I was just curious, how did it pertain to circumcision? Did they circumcise their...
Circumcision, good question. Circumcision. For classical reformists, it wasn't important. It wasn't central to observance for the same reason, because it's not spiritually elevated. Remember, that was the essential criteria. Anything that doesn't elevate spiritually is not important. Essentially, the classical reformists only adopted what they called ethical monotheism. Okay, so they basically looked at the Bible and saw what components of Judaism contribute to ethical behavior. And that's what they accepted and adopted. And anything that's outside of that circle, they rejected and discarded. So this would include, of course, the dietary laws, Sabbath observance, strict Sabbath observance according to Halacha. They still kept, the Sabbath, the day of rest, but the Sabbath didn't necessarily have to be Saturday, it could be Sunday. And circumcision would also be included in that category. It's something that's not necessary, and it's not spiritually elevating. Okay, I want to talk briefly about Mordecai Kaplan. Such an important figure in Judaism that I cannot leave him out of the discussion here. Mordecai Kaplan is affiliated with the Reconstructionist movement. Oh, I'm sorry, I have to get to the conservative first, because Mordecai Kaplan is actually a response to the conservative movement. So first, let's talk about the conservative movement. what did the conservative movement not like about reform and about orthodoxy that it had to create this alternative, this blend, this hybrid between the two? Well, first of all, the conservative Judaism rejected this radical reevaluation of all Jewish tradition. Okay? So let sleeping dogs lie. Okay? Don't upset the apple cart. If things are okay, then don't reevaluate, don't revolutionize things. So that was the first plank in the platform of conservative Judaism. But on a more practical level, what they rejected is they wanted to hold on to tradition, despite the fact that certain parts of tradition were not scientifically acceptable. Because if you evaluate it scientifically based on the Enlightenment and based on other ideals of the modern world, maybe it's not necessary. But the conservative people did not feel comfortable on a gut level. Okay, feeling is extremely important to conservative Jews. For Reform people, it's everything about intellectual. It's everything about reason. If it doesn't make sense, get rid of it. For conservative Jews, it doesn't make sense, but I'm still going to keep it because I'm comfortable doing it. So for a conservative Jew, for example, Solomon Schechter is the one who first standardized conservative Judaism, and he was a very rigorously trained scientist. And he was, of course, famous for the Cairo Geniza. Like, he found the Cairo Geniza in Egypt, and then he published it, and he became world famous in response to that. And this is why the early conservative movement hired him for the position, because he was also a scientist, but at the same time, he was very sensitive to tradition. Okay, he was eager to observe kashrut and to observe the traditional rituals in the synagogue. You know, for example, the early conservative Zacharias Frankel, the founder of Jewish Theological Seminary in Breslau, who was also an early proponent of conservative Judaism. So he was against prayers in English, for example. Now, prayers in English are halachically permissible. Tefillah b'chol lashon. And yet, ironically, this is something that conservative Jews put a lot of emphasis on, because why get rid of it? It's so beautiful, it's so great, why get rid of it? So this is essentially, that's their guideline. Their guideline is, if it feels Jewish and if you feel comfortable doing it, keep it. And another example is, I'm sorry, just a second, let me finish my thought. Another example is biblical criticism. Okay, Solomon Schechter and other professors at JPS were accepting of the documentary hypothesis. Maybe it wasn't authored by God. Divine revelation wasn't important. It wasn't a central tenet in conservative Jew. You didn't have to accept that to be a conservative Jew. But yet at the same time, when you walk into the synagogue, you put on a prayer shawl and you put on the phylacteries, okay, and you keep kashrut. So it's a little bit contradictory if you think about it. But that's how they felt very comfortable doing so. And so why did they feel comfortable doing so? Well, in part, it's in response to the wave of Eastern European Jews who immigrated in the years between 1880 and 1924. Over 2 million, about 2.5 million Jews arrived in those years. And those Eastern Europeans, they didn't come from a country that had been enlightened. They came from Eastern Europe. So for them, it was all too much for them. Too much for them to handle. So when they came to America, they were not, reform seemed too alien to them. Because reform was just too radical and too strange to what they were used to. And so the conservative movement especially appealed to the Eastern European immigrants, starting in the 1880s, who wanted something, and wanted at the same time be scientific, be upwardly mobile, okay, pursue a profession, pursue a degree, pursue an education, and accept American culture for the most part, but at the same time, keep their observance for the most part. Which brings me to the question of how is conservative Judaism different from Orthodox? Well, the answer to that is that, as you've noticed, in philosophy, they're extremely liberal, right? So that's one of the differences. But the other difference is that if necessary, changes can be made. Okay? So under Reform, we reevaluate everything and we make wholesale changes to everything. Under Orthodox, no changes can be made at all. Under Conservative, it's a process. They call it historical Judaism. Okay, Judaism evolves. Okay, so they see it. So historical Judaism means that if the previous generation did it, that's a reason for us to do it, unless there's a pressing reason not to, based on the society we live in, or based on something else. So, for example, the most famous practice that the conservative Jews eliminated was, does anyone know? 1949, hint?
Deaf women rabbis, I guess?
Has to do with the suburbs, driving on Shabbat. Because in 1949, they issued a decree that said that you're allowed to drive on Shabbat to the synagogue. And of course, the Orthodox were extremely angry because up until then, the Orthodox were kind of, it wasn't a clear demarcation between them. And after that, it was like all hell broke loose. We cannot accept that. And so that's when the line was clearly drawn between Orthodox and conservative Judaism. So let me just briefly talk about Kaplan, and then I'm going to open the floor for questions. Okay, so Kaplan is he was a graduate from JTS, and he also lectured. He was a professor at JTS. So basically, he was inspired by he was educated by the organization, by the movement that eventually gave birth to conservative Judaism. So he would have or should have been a conservative rabbi, but he didn't like it. He had a beef with the conservative movement. The problem was that he saw the conservative movement as too dogmatic, okay, too unaccepting of change, at least in certain scientific ideas. And so for him, he very emphatically promoted the idea, for example, that Jews are people. He wrote a book called Jews and Civilization. All right, so for him, he wanted his congregants to be very comfortable with the fact that we are distinct, we are a people, and we are not necessarily simply American. So he's the first to come up with this idea of sort of like a subculture, okay, if you will. Like Jews can be Jews as a culture, and at the same time embrace their host culture of America. So this is something that Reform would vehemently reject, but even the conservative movement rejected this idea, because the conservative movement saw, they insisted on preserving tradition and keeping tradition, but as far as nationality, as far as acculturation, as far as who are you as a person, what's your culture, you are an American. And for him, he first propounded this idea that no, Jews and civilization. And this is the name of his book. It's a very famous book. You can take it out to the library, buy it. Jews and civilization. That's the motto and idea of Mordecai Kaplan. So he was unsatisfied. He was kicked out of the conservative movement because his ideas were too strange. And he founded his own thing, the Reconstructionist. And he founded there's a thing called Society for Advancement of Judaism. It's on the Upper West Side, I believe. You can go visit it. It's right next to the Jewish Center, which is where he served as rabbi before he was expelled, or before he actually resigned. And he went to Society for Advancement of Judaism, which gave birth to Reconstructionist Judaism.
He actually is the founder of the Jewish Center. He's not just the first rabbi, he founded it.
That might be true. If you say so, I believe you. He may, but ultimately, the board was dissatisfied with his leadership, and so they either fired him or he resigned from. So eventually,
he was a rabbi there for years and years, and even after he quit being a rabbi, he was very influential, even amongst the Orthodox.
True. Yeah. Very true. Yeah.
Not just that, but Mordecai Kaplan went beyond just thinking of Judaism as a civilization. He did not believe in God the way other Jews believed in. God as a process, whatever the hell that means, as opposed to God as
right. Thank you, Benny, for noting that. In fact, I forgot to mention that, but you're very, very right. Yes. So that's the other thing. That's the other reason. I think the UOJ, right, the Luther one I saw earlier, they excommunicated him because of this, because he said his theology was a Dewey kind of theology, John Dewey, like a naturalistic theology. He didn't see God as an ontological, disparate entity. Rather, he saw God as the whole of nature, the natural processes overall. Yes.
I just wanted to say something very interesting. I was told that the Shalom Aleichem, that's very classical. Shalom Aleichem, Malachei Asher. You've heard that, right? That song, that's sung in all Jewish homes, it was taught in a conservative synagogue. That's what I was told. So it's interesting that some things from conservatism has been adapted by even Orthodoxy.
Right.
But only believe what you see and then what you hear.
Yes.
So
can you speak over?
Sure.
Speak up or come closer.
Okay. So actually, what's interesting is that they teach this in every JTS class you go to, is that in the early stages of JTS, biblical criticism was actually not really promoted, and there was actually, even though there was still the influence of the Wissenschaft, the Judentum.
This is Shabbos Judentum, right?
Right. Sorry, I might have mangled up a little bit. Emphasis on an academic and historical critical approach. There's this idea that high biblical criticism versus low biblical criticism. Low biblical criticism was promoted. The high biblical criticism, however, was called high anti-Semitism, and that was associated with the Christian biblical criticism, the Protestant anti-Semites. So just as kind of giving a little bit more nuance or flavor to it, JTS in earlier stages was not into high biblical criticism.
Thank you for noting that. Thank you. Yes.
I grew up as a Reconstructionist / conservative, and I remember learning about Hebrew school, the idea of what is God. I don't know about that term about God as a process. It doesn't seem it doesn't sound familiar, but
does not or does?
Does not.
Does not, and you grew up Reconstructionist.
Yeah.
And in what year?
The 80s and 90s.
80s and 90s. It's possible that the Reconstructionist movement itself underwent some change. The tendency in recent decades has been to move towards the right. And throughout all of Judaism, the conservative, the Reconstructionist, the everyone's moving to the right. So it's possible, I don't know the Reconstructionist movement that well, but it's possible that while the original Reconstructionist adherents accepted God as a cosmological process, right? In later years, they reversed that, and either they openly reversed that, or they just simply kept quiet about it.
God was referred to as not necessarily this idea in Orthodoxy where it's this king, this humanistic type person. It was never referred to in a human way. It was more of a I was always taught as a kid, God is all around you, God is everywhere, God is in everything, but there's no thought of God as any person type figure.
So that reinforces the idea of a cosmological God.
Right, and then
so he's not a person. He's the nature that we encounter. He's what inspires us to be ethical and to do the right thing, and etc. So so that's
a king, and you're bowing to a king and worshiping like a king of God, and not at all.
Okay, in that case, yeah. So what you're saying actually, confirms my interpretation.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Yes.
Talk loud, please.
God is never viewed as a person. He's always spiritual, and one of Psalm 13 encourages that he has no physical form. He's given these terms. He has a hand, the hand of God, the anger of God, only so that as a teaching mechanism, we can understand things as we, with our finite mortal brain, because we are human, will be able to understand traits that are referred to, but it's more in the way of analogy or metaphor we're referring to him. It's not meant in any literal reference that attributes being any kind of person or having any physical form. He is totally infinite wisdom of God, and he has no place, he's not physical. We have all of these terms that refer to him in other than physical, above physical, spiritual manifestation, to the exclusion of any physical or human form.
Right, but there's never a thing where you fear God. The idea of fear of God?
Yes, because you have to remember he's the boss.
Okay, let me comment on that. Maimonides' conception of God is not the Complete conception of God. There's a big difference. Maimonides did believe in an ontological God. He believed that this God was not human-like, right? He's not an anthropomorphic God, right? You cannot attribute human characteristics to him. He doesn't grow old. What else? There's not a hand and a foot. So Maimonides goes to great lengths to explain, right, unlimited space, etc. And so Maimonides goes to great lengths to explain those verses that refer to God like hand or leg or sight or smell as being metaphorical, right? As simply the savera ta'uzim,
pedagogical, as being teaching,
instructive, right? To create certain imageries in our mind to get a better idea of what simply ethereal God is like.
And how he relates to us so that we can understand.
However, this God does exist. He is the perfection of all things, but he is distinct according to Maimonides. He's extremely perfect. He's the perfect of all perfection. He's not limited by anything, but he is a distinct entity. But according to Kaplan, he is not a distinct entity. He's part of the natural process that we see, that we observe in our daily lives. Yes?
I remember discussions
Oh, louder, please.
I remember discussions with Reconstructionists who were also students of Rob Heschel's, which complicates a little the denominational.
Can you please speak up and come closer? I cannot
It
hear
kind
you.
of complicates the denominational separation because there was a great Hasidic Rebbe who taught in the conservative shul, and some of the Reconstructionists used to argue and also learn from him. And I remember that one of the themes, because I have a lot of things I learned from some Reconstructionists over the years, was that in the Shema, the second half of the part of the Shema, where you're saying, the part of the includes your mind. So instead of making a catechism of what you're supposed to believe about Hashem, it was that in order to actually serve Hashem, you have to bring your mind. So not make up any lies that someone else told you you're supposed to believe, but actually be willing to stand there and find out what is the real encounter and what you really believe. So you can ask any question.
And what does God mean to me? What is my personal experience?
And you can ask any question in the universe. But they wanted the traditional question and the reform question.
This sounds a little Kaplanian, because it's essentially the idea is that we can modernize God and we can customize God to our own circumstances and our own conceptions of it. It's very important. Our conception of God, according to Kaplan, is very important. It's not ontological. It doesn't exist separate from our minds. He's in our minds. Okay, that's very important.
That's
our
very
experience.
different than what I'm saying. That's the opposite of what I'm saying. He's saying like if it's real. I'm not speaking for Kaplan, but certainly in that debate of JTS people, including Kaplan and Rav Heschel, and a lot of the young people, they were definitely at that time was the idea that if you're serious, then in what you're doing as a Jew, you have to be willing to go through both the faith challenging and the faith building by not by going through the motions of serving, but by actually asking the questions, not to customize and make God what you want to make him, but by not making him what your uncle or somebody else from the old country told you.
How many people here were brought up in a conservative 1, 2, 3? I was brought up in one, and I was actually in this synagogue in my mother's womb. This was my grandfather and my mother's synagogue, where we are right now at OPJC. And I remember my first memories are in this synagogue and asking my grandfather, which was a conservative synagogue, why I couldn't sit with my mother, even though it was conservative. Now, in other synagogues, the conservatives could actually, and I remember talking to my mother about God, or her relationships, because she would bench lock and she would kiss us, and her God was inside of her heart. She would talk to her heart, she would pray to her heart, and her concept of Judaism was not the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox, was kind of like the enemy, because they were brought up back in the old country, like the Amish, and the Jews who came over in the boats from Eastern Europe, like my mother came from Poland, they came here and they wanted to be free, they wanted to be assimilated, they wanted to be part of the future, not part of the past.
But at the same time, God was very real to them. I just want to note something, that you mentioned that the temple was conservative, but it was separate seating. That was unusual for the conservative movement overall, because most conservative synagogues, especially after World War II, had mixed seating. So it was unusual. The photo that you see right here, that's Solomon Schechter on the right, and the Cairo, a very famous photo. So Salomon Schechter, of course, is also famous for the Schechter school, the day school movement. The day school movement, by the way, is an innovation also of the conservative subject, to some extent the Orthodox. But it was certainly not practiced by the Reform. Why not? Because again, for the Reform people, you don't send your child to a separate school. Okay, you're not a distinct peoplehood. You're not a distinct nation. Okay, you don't separate yourself from the masses. Okay, so if everyone goes to the public school, you go to public school. And for the Reform, even the concept of an after-school program is not something they would do every day. They do it like once a week. They go to Sunday school. Okay, because for them, it's simply, if a Christian doesn't go to school every day, you shouldn't do it either. Okay? We are simply a separate faith. We are just as American as everyone else. We behave in all other matters. We behave just like our co-citizens, the other citizens of the country. And the only difference between us and them is that in matters of faith, in matters of religion, where we practice Judaism, or what they call the Mosaic persuasion.
What were the years the conservative reform movement started?
The Salomon Schechter is the first one to refer to it as conservative with a capital C. So Salomon Schechter was hired by JPS in 1902, 04, something like that, very early 20th century. JPS underwent bankruptcy. It wasn't funded. It lost its funding. It didn't have proper backing. And then finally, Jacob Schiff, who was a huge philanthropist from the Reform movement, he came and bailed it out. It's a little ironic that he would help a conservative movement. And so why did he do it? Well, the reason he did it is because he was eager. See, the Eastern European community was a shamba for him. It embarrassed the Germans because the Germans were considered responsible to make them adapt and acculturate and assimilate. And so he wanted to fulfill his duty or his, so he felt this necessity to help them to assimilate. And this is why he did it, because he knew that the Reform movement wouldn't appeal to them. So he thought that a person like Salomon Schechter, who was at the same time, he was accepting of certain changes, and he was scientifically oriented and professional oriented, etc. And at the same time, he was sensitive to religion more than the Reform people did, and that's why he actually supported the conservative movement.
When did Reform start?
Reform is term reform. I mentioned 1825. That's the first time that a congregation or a society adopted that term. But as an organized movement encompassing various congregations, right? As a national movement, it was only united by the 1870s. 1873 is when the Union of American People Congregations was formed.
You already had Reform in Germany starting in 1780.
Right.
So when did it start there?
In Germany. In Germany, it started in the 1830s, 40s, 1850s, it picked up steam.
But it was already there in the 1780s. They were already starting to have...
No, there was no organized reform in Germany in the 18th century. It's early 19th century, 1820s, 30s, those years. That's what started. In the 18th century, you had Mendelssohn. You had ideas, but it was still traditional. It wasn't organized. The practice that we now see were not, each synagogue had different divergent ideas and divergent practices. It wasn't organized and wasn't standardized yet.
It was a reform show about 1808 in Germany that was interactive, that they would have Protestant services for the Lutherans, and they would, like try to be cooperative.
That's very early. It's possible.
It was already.
That was the earliest moment. That was the earliest
It
one.
was already in action by the.
I understand, but you're mentioning the very first, the prototype, the experimental.
An interdenominational show is very much not orthodox already.
As a massive movement that really caught on with the population, it didn't start until the 1820s, 30s, and then it took up even more steam in the mid-19th century. Okay.
1874, Schiff funded the 92nd Street Y, which is a think tank, a music tank, a cultural tank.
Of the conservative. Right, another good example. And another example is the Henry Street settlement. Right, Schiff also funded that. So Schiff funded a lot of efforts, a lot of charity efforts that operated within the immigration and immigrant community. And the reason he did it again is because he realized that they were never going to become reformed. He had no illusions about that. The reason he did it is because he felt responsible for them, and also because he wanted to remove the taint, quote unquote, of these new immigrants. Because other Americans would tell you, you're Jewish, and they're Jewish. look how crummy and disgraceful your religion is. So he wanted to basically put up a new facade, make it seem nicer, seem more adaptive and more acceptable. So he wanted those immigrants essentially to assimilate to some extent. If you don't want to be reformed, okay, but get rid of your beer, okay, and go to college. And he succeeded. And yeah, so those organizations like 92nd Street Wide and the Henry Street Settlement and the others were very effective. Okay, Sabata Marias, I'm showing you a picture of him. He was an early proponent of what later became conservative, but he was affiliated with the JTS. He's the founder of the JTS. And he was Italian born, he was a Chazan, cantor, because many congregations back then, they didn't hire rabbis, they just hired a cantor. The Americans wanted autonomy from the rabbis. They didn't want to be subservient to the rabbis. So they hired a Chazan who also doubled as a shofet and the kohel and all those other different roles. So the modern conservative Judaism ushered in by Schechter probably would not have been acceptable to him. He was more traditional. But he was the founder of JTS, and like somebody mentioned here, the early JTS, like you mentioned, like the early JTS was more traditional. The early JTS was, to a large extent, they still spoke Yiddish. This was like in first, second generation, and they were very traditional. They were scientific, right? They believed in studying things and professional, and in other manners, in other ways, they adopted American practices. But at the same time, when it came to ritual, they made little changes. Rabbi Jacob Joseph, very interesting figure. Rabbi Jacob, the Orthodox community was very divided and split. And finally, in 1889, I think that's the year, or the late 1880s, they finally decided in New York City that they wanted the kashrut laws in New York City were abysmal in those years. Nobody kept kashrut properly. And so they decided to hire this Rabbi Jacob Joseph from Vilna, and they gave him the title as Chief Rabbi of New York City. A new title. Didn't exist until then. And the idea was that he would clean house, right? He would organize the kashrut supervision, and he instituted a tax, 1 cent per chicken, to get a stamp, kashrut seal.
What year is this?
This is 1889. This is a specific year, by the way, because a year afterwards he was gone. So what happened is, it's funny, right? So what happened is the butchers revolted. How dare you put a 1 cent tax on a chicken? You can't afford that. So this is how little regard the people at the time had for kashrut. Essentially, they didn't care about it. They like, who cares? Like, it's kosher. You don't need to, don't tell us, don't supervise us. You don't need your approval that it's kosher. I tell you it's kosher. And so basically, what seems to have happened is that people didn't realize they had cognitive dissonance, so to speak. They didn't fully appreciate what they were getting themselves into. On the one hand, they wanted a European trained rabbi, right? They wanted to bolster the laws of kashrut and the observance of kashrut, but at the same time, they actually, I mean, he didn't do anything radical. It's normal. I mean, it does cost money. The money went for his salary and for administrative costs. There's no graft in the process. He didn't do anything wrong, but they were just not psychologically fully prepared for this thing. And the other thing is that many of the petty rabbis in New York City, they felt, oh, this newcomer, I've been here for years, and this guy just came off the boat, and he's chief rabbi, and he gets this nice salary, and it has all the prestige, and he gets all the acclaim, and what do I get? And so they were not fully behind him. Many of the original congregations that actually invited him to come over, they didn't stand behind him when he actually put the program into effect. So a year later, the whole thing disintegrated, and his position evaporated, and eventually, things reverted to the way they were before, which is that each butcher single-handedly certifies that or affirms that my food is kosher. kosher. What does that mean? I don't know. Nobody knows what it means. It's kosher. I'm not saying they probably did slaughter. Probably. I don't know. But did they check the knife before? You know, did they check the lungs of the animal? Nobody supervised it. Nobody cared.
It was a feeling.
Yeah, it was a feeling. Exactly. It was a feeling. It felt kosher. There were a lot of signs. They were all over the Lower East Side. There were signs of basar kosher. These people with such ignoramuses that sometimes the basar kosher was misspelled, and you would see basar. Right? Meat. And some people say that the reason they had to spell it this way is because it wasn't kosher, so they couldn't do false advertising. They couldn't put out basar, so they wouldn't make a claim that's not true. But at the same time, it spelled kosher because it was Hebrew characters. Yeah,
It's good enough.
it was good enough, yeah.
Maybe one of the problems was they were taxing the wrong people.
Who should they?
Because to be a shulchan, it's a very hard job. It's a very holy and very hard job, and I refuse to believe that the shulchans of the time were not interested in kashrus. I don't believe it.
It raised the price. At the cent meant a lot of
that
money.
doesn't mean that might have meant a concern about poverty and about making a living and a lot of other things. And like today, sometimes we're charging the wrong people. Like maybe the community should be paying instead of penalizing the shulchan who's doing one of the hardest jobs.
The shoftim at the time were married. The slaughterers, the butchers were the ones who basically they were the proximate cause for his downfall. They were the ones who revolted against him. And why? Yes, I understand why. At the time, the primary objective of American Jews was integration. Okay, they wanted to succeed in America. And then anything that related to halacha, to observance, to tradition, to identity, took second place, played second fiddle. And this interfered because money was a very critical commodity back then. These were immigrants, second generation, ascent meant a lot of money for them. And it was so obvious. See, that's the other thing. See, nowadays, a lot of products are marketed through ingenious ways that the consumer is not aware that they're paying for it, right? But if somebody is aware that I'm paying a cent more per chicken because it's certified kosher by RJJ, no, I don't want to do that. I can buy chicken in front of another slaughter who also says it's kosher. It says kosher, he doesn't charge me the additional cent, right? But that's how he deludes himself. It's just as kosher. It's not just as kosher. But he thinks that it's just as kosher because the butcher is advertising that it's just as kosher. It's the same problems that we have nowadays with our marketing economics. We have people advertising things that they are in a certain way, and they attract consumers to buy them, but they're inferior from the true product, from the brand name. Okay, some other...
The mashgiach actually certifies the kashrus. He doesn't create the kashrus.
Of course, but...
So if we value the mashgiach, it's actually an educational...
But in terms of reliability,
it's
right? In terms of reliability, having
I'm not against it, but I'm just saying, like, it's an educational and inspection role, and the community would have needed to stand up for it as an educational role, rather than putting down the shulchan team, and maybe that's part of the reason why it didn't work. I'm just suggesting because we have some similar strokes today.
Seems to be discrediting them.
Just in
Saying that
case.
they're not credible to say this is kosher unless you have the stamp. That's an embarrassment. Saying
Not,
that you don't trust flesh.
yeah, but I don't think that was the point. That wasn't the reason.
You don't think that was
The reason was because it was so obvious that everyone was paying a cent for it. It was too stark.
Who wants to get robbed for no reason?
Yeah, I
It's
don't
turning
think.
a kosher Jewish thing into a corporation.
I think the money was the biggest issue, and the fact that the slaughterers had to charge more, and they felt they were being put at a disadvantage because the consumer would go to a different shulchan, or the consumer would stop keeping kosher altogether. And for them, they had to be in business. That was very important. And if they thought that they were going to lose business because of this, then that was a reason for them to object. Okay, the Ramaz, Moses, Zebulun, Margulies. Anyone heard of her? The Ramaz was, of course, you have the Ramaz Day School nowadays, which is named after him. So he was an early exponent of orthodoxy. So orthodoxy, what does orthodoxy mean? The early orthodoxy, how did it differ from conservative Judaism? Well, it differed in theory. And to a large extent, it differed in theory, which means it did not accept the validity, for example, divine revelation. Okay? It insisted on divine revelation. It insisted that Torah Shabbat Peh, like the oral law, was passed on, was transmitted, right, through Moses on Sinai. So a lot of the theoretical underpinnings of Judaism, which under conservative Judaism is okay. It's okay to question. It's acceptable. As long as you tefillin and they observe Shabbat. You can go to university, you can question, you can engage in the scientific process. But for the Orthodox, that was much more frowned upon. And so he was a proponent of orthodoxy. And so here you have a picture of the Ramaz, and it's interesting that in the left photo you see this mashketel. So he was a first generation immigrant. He still spoke Yiddish, and the Ramaz is affiliated with KJ. I'm sure many of you have heard KJ, Kahal, what is it called? Kilat Jeshurun, right? On the upper
Curious Joe.
Upper East Side. Upper East Side. Thank you. Right. He was born in Europe somewhere, and he came. And it's very interesting because his grandson was Joseph Lookstein, and he took over after he passed away. He took over his pulpit, and he became much more modernized. So look at this next photo. Joseph Lookstein is also affiliated with KJ and with centrist orthodoxy. I wouldn't even call it modern orthodoxy. Modern orthodoxy is a term that it's a post-World War II term. So I would call the pre-World War II orthodoxy of the upper, would you say upper east side or west side?
East.
Upper east side. Okay, so that kind of, that milieu, maybe you can't call it modern orthodoxy, centrist, whatever you want to call it. Orthodoxy, simply plain orthodoxy. And so that differs very much from other streams of orthodoxy, especially the Haredi version and others. Next slide. Okay, so let me open the floor. Did I cover everything? More or less. Okay, let me open the floor for questioning because I've talked too much already. Okay, questions, official questions now.
You have a segment tonight on Rabbi Heschel. I think he's a very dynamic figure. I can't figure
Abraham Joshua Heschel?
I read his book.
Which Heschel? Abraham Joshua?
Yeah, he seems very dynamic. Do you have anything on him?
I don't have anything on him. The one thing I know about Abraham Joshua Heschel is that he participated in the civil rights movement. He marched hand in hand with other black leaders. And so, yeah, he was, obviously...
I'll tell you why he was dynamic and a little controversial, because he taught in JTS, you know that. But to my knowledge, he was Orthodox. All his writings are strictly Orthodox, and he believed in Torah B'Shamayim. But yeah, I heard I don't think he found a home. They never gave him 10 years.
Did he touch women?
Maybe that's why.
Did he hug women?
I would think he kept halacha. From what I gathered, he was strictly Orthodox.
It's possible that the reason he didn't get tenure from that is because his views were a little too traditional. It's possible.
One of the interesting things is that the conservative movement was very sympathetic with the civil rights movement.
And the reform too. Both of them.
And that actually a lot of the funding that came to support the civil rights movement came from the conservative and the Jewish community. They were the ones really funding.
The statistics say that 50% of the white people who marched south and participated in all those activities to try to integrate the South were Jewish. That's a huge number. 50%. And many of them got arrested. Many of them got arrested in the South.
Two of the three that died in 1963 were Jewish boys. Yeah.
But the
The
question
Jews
is
are very, why?
why?
Why? Because for several reasons. For one, the Jews just came. This was just after the Holocaust, right? So they felt. I don't know. Right. So yeah. So 10, 20 years after the Holocaust, and they felt on an experiential level. They felt sympathetic to them because the same persecution that they're undergoing. That's what we've been undergoing all our history, and it culminated with the Holocaust. So it was natural, it was organic for them to sympathize and embrace their cause. But secondly, the other reason why reform conservative movements embrace that is because they strongly believe, as opposed to orthodoxy, which places primary emphasis on practice, for the reform of the conservative, the ideals and the ethical precepts of Judaism are also extremely important. And for them, this empathy, right, with the cause of the poor, the downtrodden, and the oppressed. Okay, so all of those ideas are very central in their theology. Not just keeping the actual ritual law. Right? So for them, and so yes, you mentioned conservative, true, but also the reform. The reform are also extremely active. Okay, so the reform reform strongly believe in prophetic Judaism, ethical monotheism, strongly believe in distilling the Torah, our tradition, into its ethics. Right? What does God really want from us? It's not about the legalistic aspect. It's about, let's see broadly what the bigger picture is.
Really pronounced reformed or is it deformed?
Reformed, yes. Okay.
So what's interesting is to what degree can you find elements of, I don't know, Hasidus or like also some like Kabbalistic ideas that become kind of ingrained in kind of interesting ways within more liberal movements. So for instance, you have ideas around Tikkun and so on that become Tikkun Olam in a very kind of social justice-oriented way within conservative Judaism and other movements. You have ideas around ongoing, of the idea of revelation as not being something which is static, but which is ongoing, and that you can talk about also within a kind of Kabbalistic dialectic that also has reverberations within conservative Judaism and other liberal movements as well, which actually serves the basis or creates the basis for a more dynamic form of halacha, because if revelation is ongoing, then arguably so too is the halachic process, and that connection is made, I would argue, as well. So it's interesting that what we perceive as being, some people might argue that the complete bastardization of these ideas, but you could argue that they're also intimately connected and wouldn't necessarily develop in such a way, if not for these earlier antecedents found in what we would perceive as more traditional.
Okay, to summarize what you said, you're saying that there are certain Kabbalistic influences on conservative and reform Judaism. Okay, my mark on that would be that Tikkun Olam is a Hebrew terminology for a concept that existed way before it's completely independent from any Kabbalistic influence. Because the idea of Tikkun Olam in English would simply be social justice, right? And so social justice is something that the early reformists saw, like I explained earlier, as the essence of what Judaism is all about. Because they saw, the early Reformed Jews, they saw Orthodox Judaism as a corrupted form of Judaism. Because they don't put the Bible, they started reading Isaiah and all the other prophets. And they saw, oh, this is what they want. You know, what does the prophet say? In the name of God. I am going to ask you to sacrifice, what do I ask you? Not to sacrifice animals. I ask you, what does it say? It's a very famous verse in Isaiah, which basically summarizes this whole idea, which is that God says, I don't want your sacrifices.
That's not what he says. That's not what he says. He doesn't want corrupt people bringing sacrifices.
I'm literally translating the verse. The verse does say that. And literally, the literal translation says, I do not want your sacrifices, I do want a pure heart and being kind to one another. That's what the prophet said. So to them, the reformists put emphasis on prophetic Judaism, on the prophets, at the expense of the Pentateuch. In other words, the purity laws of Leviticus were not that important, but the prophetic ideals of what Judaism stands for, those that put emphasis on that. So for them, social justice is very important because that's the essence of Judaism. It's not the legalism, it's not the ritual, it's not the purity laws, the priestly laws. It's about justice. It's about being kind, being honest, okay, helping one another. It's all about social matters. Right. So yeah.
Okay, so what my question though is, okay, just as there are arguments that that Sabbateanism was not such a radical break from an already pre-existing structure that allowed it to be created.
Okay, can somebody put on the lights, please?
The question no such thing as me. That's just
What I'm saying is, that's my question. Is there an appropriation though, in the same language we say, you're going to allow
modern reformists do like to use Hebrew terminology, right? As opposed to the classical reformists who discarded everything Hebrew. And so for them, yes, they would naturally refer to the Hebrew terms. How do you say social justice in Hebrew? So they use the law. So maybe they borrow the actual term, they may borrow from Kabbalistic circles, but the idea is completely independent. In fact, it means the correction, the improvement of the world, of society, along this better translated. Fixing.
I think it's a certain historiography thing. I'm not sure whether or not. I think that's one historiography. I'm not so sure. Like, maybe some section or whatever. I don't know.
Well, I know the history of reform, and reform was, reform scorned. In fact, there was one reformist who said, they called Kabbalism as the garbage of literature. Why not? Because it's a possibility, but it's not like that historically. If you're asking how did the bat get wings, right? It's not the same as the mammalian evolution of the bat. The bird, right? The bat is an animal. So the bat's wings is completely independently evolved from a fly's wings, for example. Right? It looks the same. It's certainly similar function, but it's completely independent. It's not related. Okay, different birds evolve birds from the same source, but not so the same a fly and a bird. Okay, a fly also has wings, but they have separate effects, separately inspired, separate natural tendencies for it, etc. So that was my answer. Like historically, they're not affiliated. So yes, are there different ideas in Kabbalism? Yes, of course there are. But it's a completely different vantage point. I mean, their starting point and their process of reasoning and their conclusions, everything is different.
How come you left the freedom off the list?
About what?
How come there's no ultra-orthodox?
Oh, ultra-orthodox. Yes, I only have, so much material that I could cover. I didn't get to it the rest of it. I can't do it. What? Would you want another time? If you clamor for another lecture, then maybe there will be.
But I might clamor for it to be in Central Park.
I agree. So speak to Isaac, and if there's enough demand, we'll do another one.
One thing about the conservative movement, having been brought up in that, is that they really go on intuition a lot more than they go on laws, and yet they have their own interpretation of what was work. And that's so with the convenience. So if you need to drive on Shabbos, you drive on Shabbos.
That wasn't the suburbs of the 50s.
No, even here in